Now let's take a look at this much discussed episode that deals with a notorious heretic whose name was Michael Servetus. Michael Servetus was Spanish by birth, and by education he was a physician, doctor of medicine. He came into conflict not only with Calvin, but with the whole Christian community, Catholic as well as Protestant, because he became an outspoken critic of the doctrine we know as the Trinity. He did what many others have done since that time, concluded that belief in one God, revealed in three fully and equal divine persons, is absurd. One does not equal three, three do not equal one. It's a plain matter of fact. And he had no hesitation in making his views public. And he therefore fell into the clutches of the Roman Catholic Inquisition. Habsburg authorities tried him and condemned him to death by burning, standard mode of execution. However, he escaped. Now, we would think, wouldn't you, that if you were in his position, having escaped from the Inquisition, you'd dig a hole as deep as you could find and hide there for the rest of your life. Of course, I'm being facetious, but you would do everything possible to get out of the public eye and to avoid being discovered. That's not what this man did. He regarded his anti-Trinitarian view as something of a mission, that he had a duty to proclaim his doctrine. And so he wrote about it, published against the Trinity, insulted Calvin personally. He had a great dislike for Calvin. His first published writing against the Trinity appeared in 1531. Now that would be almost coincident with Calvin's conversion. So it had nothing to do with Calvin per se. But he entitled that book, The Errors of the Trinity. That's what brought him to the attention of Catholic authorities and led to his condemnation for heresy. Later, much later, 1553, 22 years later, he published a more important document, The Restitutes of the Christian Religion. Now, do you see the play on words there?
Yeah.
Calvin had already produced the Institutes. Servetus now produced the Restitutes. And by Restitutes, what he really meant was his work was going to restore true Christianity. That Catholics and Protestants alike had a false conception of God. And he was going to restore the true conception of God, and therefore he was the champion of genuine Christianity. There's no doubt about it, his second book, he intended as an attack on Calvin. He really despised Calvin and therefore took opportunity to criticize him. So far, that's what happened. Next thing, though, is so difficult to understand. Maybe nobody has ever understood it. Why did Servetus appear in Geneva? Surely he had no reason to expect a welcome. He'd already established his reputation as a notorious heretic. He'd already once been condemned to death for it. He had previously insulted Calvin. So why did he go to Geneva? All we can do is speculate about it. There's no real clear answer to it. One likely explanation is that Calvin's enemies invited him there. They wanted to stage a confrontation between Servetus and Calvin, and they hoped that would discredit Calvin and maybe force him to leave. Well, that's a logical possibility. But if we're looking for documentary evidence to support it, I've never found any. So maybe it's correct, maybe it's not. But the fact is he did appear in Geneva. And the civil law in Geneva prescribed the death penalty for those who denied the Trinity. That was an influence from the old Roman law code. In Constantine's day, when Christianity, or in the days of Theodosius, 380s, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, at that point the Roman law code included an item pronouncing the death penalty for any who denied the Trinity. So that law in Geneva was not unprecedented, it was not an innovation. Calvin, though, when he presented the ecclesiastical ordinances to the city government, 1541, said that the punishment for denying the Trinity ought to be banishment. So the ecclesiastical ordinances provided for banishment, but the older legal code called for the death penalty. When Calvin learned that Servetus was in the city, he reported his presence to the authorities. They put him in jail. Calvin visited him there and tried to correct the man's errors, to no avail at all. The angry Servetus referred to Calvin as another Simon Magus. Remember Simon the magician from the book of Acts? Yeah. In other words, he's saying that Calvin's conception of God is just a magic trick. Yeah, that's really what he meant by it. And so the trial went forward with Calvin bringing the charge against Servetus. But that's where Calvin's involvement stopped, because remember, Calvin was still not a citizen. He had no civil authority. He could not enact the death penalty on anybody for any reason. But the court considered the case and did in fact sentence Servetus to death by burning. Calvin tried to intervene. He argued that death by burning was a very cruel method of execution. So instead it should be death by decapitation. Chop off his head. Because that's instant death and would involve very little painful suffering. Now here's more evidence that Calvin was not the dictator, because the court rejected Calvin's appeal and ordered death by burning anyhow. And so the execution occurred. The enemies of Calvin then and ever since have always tried to magnify this episode out of all proportion to reality, and to make it appear that this was customary practice in Geneva, that every Tuesday afternoon there'd be a public burning for the entertainment of the citizens. Well, not so. I mean, if there were public burnings all the time, this one would not have acquired any particular significance. But it's because it was an exceptional event that we remember it. Now, having said all of that, there's no way of emancipating Calvin from all responsibility in this. Can't be done. But keep in mind what I've said to you so repeatedly, and I know it bores you to death, but it's important that we don't forget it. That we are thinking like 21st century people always would. We live in an open culture where there's no penalty for believing what we choose, and where most of our fellow citizens think it doesn't matter what anybody believes anyhow. I mean, everybody here can afford to be tolerant because most people think it doesn't matter. But in the 16th century, that was not the mode of thinking. I mean, almost everybody thought that a proper understanding of the nature of God was essential for salvation, and that rejecting that truth made a person deserving of the death penalty. So, while Calvin was somewhat involved, he was not the magistrate, did not call for the sentence, had nothing to do with enacting the sentence, and actually pleaded for a change. Although they consented to the decision to execute the man. After 1553, there were no more episodes like this, no more public attacks even on Calvin, and the city government agreed that it would recognize that the church alone had the right to excommunicate people. Excommunication would be with the church magistrates, the church consistory. The magistrates would keep out of it. So that was a bit of a victory for the church.